Our next speaker is Shailly Gupta Barnes, Policy Director at the Kairos Center. She coordinated and edited the Souls of Poor Folk, Auditing America report for the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, which laid the basis for the campaign's moral agenda. And most recently, the 2019 Poor People's Moral Justice Jubilee Policy Platform. Let's welcome my colleague and friend, Shailly Gupta Barnes.
Thank you, Savina and Cole and Bill and John. I've already learned so much this morning from everybody who's been part of this conversation. So I wanted to spend, and thank you for the organizers of this event for inviting the Kairos Center and the Poor People's Campaign to be a part of this conversation. I wanted to spend the time that I had talking about the conditions we're facing, some of the economic conditions, and how this recession is different than others, and why that means revisiting how we think change is possible and where that takes us from here. And then some of the campaign's priorities moving forward. So as we already know, as we already heard, we're facing really dire conditions. And alongside this pandemic, we have this pandemic recession. And you know, the onus, the burden of that recession is really falling on poor and low income people. And that's different in some ways than other recessions, but, and I'll get to that in a second, but there's no surprise as to why this is the case. Because the pandemic is spread by close contact and in-person settings, those were the sectors of the economy that had to be shut down first. But those are also the sectors of the economy that are predominated by low wage work, by fast food, restaurants, caregiving, and other service sectors. And the people who work in those jobs are, predominantly women, disproportionately women of color. And those low wage sectors don't generally have strong worker protections, things like good wages, living wages, healthcare, let alone a welfare system that is designed to work when these millions of people are no longer working. Let alone the fact that many of these workers can't access that welfare system to begin with. I've been thinking about how the low wage jobs actually rely on this welfare system to make sure its workers have enough to eat. We all know that Walmart and McDonald's, they train their workers in how to sign up for welfare. And the welfare system, in part mainly because of 1996 welfare reform, more or less demands a low wage workforce. So when the one side of this relationship was shut down, the low wage side, the other side, the welfare side, wasn't equipped for many different reasons to handle that responsibility, and that delicate balance upon which billions of dollars has been gained on the backs of the poor was undone. Programs were stretched beyond their capacity or made marginal differences. One of our leaders and members in Minnesota talked about how her monthly SNAP payments went from, $125 a month to $130 a month, still a little over $2 a meal. Those stimulus checks are long overdue. The unemployment system is overwhelmed, and now that's ending. So this is why we're on the edge of tens of millions of evictions, why 25 million people didn't have enough to eat the week before Thanksgiving, and this profound mental and emotional health crisis that's facing families and parents and children that we have no way to deal with.
No, she was on a liquid diet, according to, it was a combination, supposed to be liquid and low carb.
We need you to mute. Could you please mute? Can you please mute? Thank you.
And so that's one side of what's been happening. And what's different again about that particular piece is that it started in the low wage sectors of the economy. That's not how most recessions start. They're often impacted, but it didn't start there. The other difference is that in other recessions, billionaires are hit along with the rest of us. And that's also different from what's happened this time around. According to the Institute for Policy Studies in 2008, it took 3 years for the Forbes 400 richest to recover from their losses from that recession. But in this pandemic recession, billionaire wealth has soared over $100 trillion, over $1 trillion. And still, and I say all this to set up this political response we're seeing, still our leaders are failing to prioritize the poor. In an attempt to compromise or come to some kind of bipartisan consensus, we have this $900 billion quote unquote bipartisan proposal, which is still trillions of dollars less than we need, and offers $300 a week in unemployment, which is the equivalent of about $7.50 an hour. We can't go in that direction. That's the wrong direction if we're trying to heal this polarization, because we're compromising on the needs of the poor, who are still on the front lines, who are holding up our economy and holding down our homes. Why are we going to compromise on them, on us? So that whole orientation has to change towards these 140 million people, these 140 million people who are living on the edge or just one emergency away from that edge, and looking at them not only as victims of injustice, but indicating the direction of where we all must go from here, that meeting their needs to the best of our ability and not the bare minimum is what is necessary. And that is what will fundamentally reorient our economy and build it up from the bottom. This is, we've applied this approach in the campaign for years, and this is what we did and leading up to the election in November, and what we will do again in Georgia. In November, we reached out to 2 million low-income voters, some of whom hadn't voted in more than a decade, in targeted states, battleground states in the Midwest and the South. We didn't ask these voters to vote for Democrats, but just to vote, to exercise the right that they had. And early reports are saying that one of the major demographic shifts was among low-income voters who moved away from Trump and towards Biden in these targeted states and across the country. And the lesson here is, do not give up on the poor. It is not, they do not vote because they're apathetic about politics, but because politics is apathetic about them. Most electoral organizing does not reach out to voters with less than 40,000 because it's understood that they don't vote, but that's not true. As Bill was saying, we are deliberately disorganized out of the political system by voter suppression, by voter deterrence, and apathy from our political parties. And so we're going to do this again in Georgia because it made a difference. And we're going to focus on the issues of the 140 million. Now, what are those issues? Well, according to our research, the main concerns that poor and low wealth people have are around their health and economic well-being. Well, aren't those everyone's concerns right now, right? Those are the issues. What if we organized our time, capacity, and resources around these issues, but began with the poor? That is the basis of the Poor People's Jubilee agenda. What is Jubilee, right? An economic program that begins with the conditions of the poor. Free the captives, release the debts, let the land rest. Why? Not out of charity and goodwill, but to revive the economy. So what is Jubilee today? It's healthcare for all, but starting with the poor. It's living wages. It's guaranteed housing, ending evictions. It's a guaranteed job and safe community for your kids. So on Monday, the Poor People's Campaign is releasing a 14-point policy plan for the first 100 days of the Biden-Harris administration that takes from that broader Jubilee agenda and says, this is what you have to focus on in the next 100 days. Many of this we've already heard, many of this we already know in terms of treatment and care, but also safe schools, food security, stimulus checks, and rapid direct payments to essential workers. We need to change the poverty measure so we can fund and structure social welfare effective, to raise the minimum wage and have a real jobs program that builds up the sectors of the economy which need it. And we have to redirect this bloated Pentagon budget towards meeting these issues as a matter of our national security. Instead of sending military equipment into our communities or into communities abroad, instead of pouring money into nuclear weapons and endless wars, let's fund our schools. Let's expand healthcare. During the pandemic, and I'm wrapping up in just a minute, the military was one of the few public institutions that was deployed to meet this crisis. We had the National Guard setting up tents, moving military ships to provide hospital beds, doing food distribution and logistics support. That's what we did because that's what we have. And it didn't work. It did not stave off the virus because deploying the military is not a public health response. We need to see public health and economic security as matters of national security, requiring the kind of investment, attention, and support that the military has received for decades. And if we begin with the health and economic security of the poor, we'll be directing our attention to the weakest parts of our system to build that up and build back better than we ever have before. Now, we know these 14 points aren't everything, but they're a step in the direction we need to go. And we maintain that if we do these things, not only will we begin to heal our body politic, we will also revive our economy. Because when you lift from the bottom, instead of waiting for trickling down, when you lift from the bottom, everybody rises. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shailly. We really appreciate you being here